Way back in the early 2000s, before smartphones, before social media told on everyone automatically, life still had room for secrets, and my wife was filling that space. At the time, we had two kids, 4 and 6 years old enough to talk, old enough to remember, old enough to casually mention things they didn't realize were strange. It started small, innocent even. "Daddy, we went to Grandma's again today." They said it the way kids talk about the weather. No drama, no warning bells, just facts. My wife's parents lived about 90 minutes away. A long drive, not impossible, but not exactly a casual pop-in either. Once a week, sure. Twice, maybe. But when it became 2, sometimes 3 times a week, that's when the feelings started. Not suspicion yet, just discomfort, like wearing a shirt that suddenly didn't fit the same way it always had. I asked her about it one night while we were clearing the table. Plates clinked softly, the TV murmured in the background. The kids were already in bed. "Your parents seem to be seeing the kids a lot lately," I said, keeping my voice neutral. She didn't look up right away. "Oh, yeah," she said. "They just like having them around." There it was. A pause, half a beat too long. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Now I'd known my wife a long time, long enough to know her tells. She was a terrible liar, always had been. When she lied, she filled space, extra words, explanations nobody asked for. So when she didn't over-explain, that's when my stomach tightened. I let it go. Not because I believed her, but because I didn't want to believe what the alternative might be. You don't jump straight to betrayal when you've built a life with someone. You walk there slowly, reluctantly, one unsettling detail at a time. The kids kept talking. "Grandpa made pancakes again. Mommy dropped us off and came back later." Came back later. That phrase stuck with me. Because if she was working her part-time job, or running errands, or just exhausted and needed help with childcare, why lie? Why not just say that? I started sleeping lighter, waking up earlier, watching more closely. And then I noticed the car. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was self-preservation. But one morning before leaving for work, I glanced at the odometer. I remembered the number. The next week I checked again, then again. I didn't need to write it down. The math became obvious fast. She was driving an extra 400 miles a week. 400! There was nowhere innocent that explained that kind of distance. That's when suspicion hardened into certainty. Something was happening behind my back, something big enough to lie about, big enough to involve our children as cover. The worst part wasn't anger yet. It was grief. Grief for the version of my life that was quietly dying while I still showed up for it every day. I didn't confront her again. Not yet. I needed proof. Real proof. The kind that couldn't be talked away. And then one afternoon, she made a mistake. Back then, we had one family computer. Big beige tower. Dial-up internet, AOL email. I came home early from work. The house was quiet. Kids still at school. Her car gone. On the desk next to the keyboard was a yellow sticky note. Her handwriting. A password. I stared at it for a long moment. I knew crossing that line would change everything. Once you see certain things, you can't unsee them. Once you know, you can't unknow. But I also knew this. If I didn't look, I'd spend the rest of my life doubting my own sanity. So I sat down, logged in, and there it was. Email after email between my wife and her college best friend. At first, it was casual, complaints, jokes, little vents about married life. Then the tone shifted. Names, references, familiarity that didn't belong to friendship. And then the line that made my hands go cold. She wasn't just cheating, she was bragging, talking about how she was regularly seeing an ex-boyfriend from high school, laughing about sneaking around, making cruel jokes about his wife, about her body, about how she'd let herself go after having kids. I remember the room going very quiet. No dramatic music, no explosion of rage, just a deep, heavy silence, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I printed everything. Page after page slid out of the printer, each one landing like another nail in a coffin. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I folded the papers carefully and hid them, because in that moment, something inside me clicked into place. This wasn't just an affair. This was calculated, repeated, mocking, and it involved my children being used as part of the routine. Whatever came next, I was going to do it right. That night, I lay next to her in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathe. I realized something then, something terrifying and clarifying at the same time. I didn't know who she was anymore, and if I wanted to protect my kids and myself, I couldn't afford to act on emotion. I needed facts. I needed leverage. I needed patience. The next morning, I made a call to an old friend, a cop. And with that single call, the quiet unraveling of my marriage turned into something else entirely, something deliberate, documented, and unstoppable. Because once I heard the words private investigator, I knew I wasn't just uncovering the truth anymore. I was preparing to end something, and I was going to make sure it stayed ended. Ron hadn't even started his investigation yet, and already I could feel the balance shifting. What I didn't know was just how much damage the truth was about to do to someone who never even knew my name.
Ron called me 2 days later. His voice was calm, professional, the kind of calm that only comes from someone who has seen worse things than this and knows exactly how these stories usually end. "I can help you," he said, "but before I do anything, I need you to understand something." I stood in my garage, with the door half open, the smell of motor oil and cold concrete filling the air. "Once we start," he continued, "you don't get to pretend you don't know anymore. Everything after this is permanent." I didn't hesitate. "I already crossed that line," I said. There was a pause, then a quiet exhale. "All right," Ron said. "Let's talk details." We met later that week in a diner off the highway. Vinyl booths, coffee that tasted burnt no matter how much cream you added. He looked exactly like you'd expect a former cop turned PI look. Older than his age, eyes that missed nothing, posture that never fully relaxed. I slid the printed emails across the table. He read them slowly, carefully. Once he finished, he didn't react the way I expected. No raised eyebrows, no judgment, just a nod. "Yeah," he said, "this tracks." He asked about schedules, about her work hours, about the kids, about the car, about the parents. I told him everything. When I was done, he leaned back and folded his arms. "She's dropping the kids off," he said. "That part's real. But she's not staying there. She's meeting somewhere nearby, probably lunch first, then somewhere private." I swallowed. "Motel?" I asked. Ron didn't smile. "Usually." I signed the retainer without blinking. From that moment on, my life split into two versions. There was the life I lived outwardly, and the life I lived internally. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still woke up early, packed lunches, kissed the kids on the forehead, asked my wife how her day was going to be, listened to her lie without flinching. Internally, everything was razor wire. Every touch felt rehearsed. Every "I love you" landed like a test I already knew the answer to. The hardest part wasn't anger, it was restraint. There's a particular kind of torture in knowing the truth while pretending you don't, in watching someone carefully construct a lie and letting them believe it's working. Some nights I'd sit in the living room after everyone was asleep, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, and wonder how long this had really been going on. Weeks? Months? Years? How many times had she kissed me after kissing him? How many jokes had she told at my expense? I stopped sleeping well. When I did sleep, I dreamt of nothing, just darkness and the sound of a car driving away. Ron checked in regularly, but he didn't give details right away. Still gathering, you'll have everything soon. That waiting, that slow drip of anticipation was brutal. Then one afternoon, he called and said, "I've got enough. You ready to see it?" We met again, this time in his office, small, sparse, filing cabinets lining the walls, a desk with neat stacks of paper, and a digital camera sitting in the corner like it carried a disease. He slid a folder toward me. Inside were photos, time-stamped, dated, labeled. There she was, my wife, sunglasses on, laughing. She parked near a strip mall, walked into a casual restaurant, and there was he, Bob. I didn't know his name yet, but I recognized the posture instantly, the confidence, the familiarity. Another photo, them sitting close, too close, her hand on his arm. Another, them leaving together. Another, a dumpy roadside motel, neon sign flickering, the kind that rented by the hour and never asked questions. Another, them exiting hours later, her fixing her hair in the reflection of the car window, him smiling like a man with nothing to lose. I stared at the images until they blurred. Ron didn't rush me. "She does this every time," he said quietly. "Same pattern, same days, same place." "What about the kids?" I asked. He slid another sheet forward. "Dropped off at her parents' at 8:12 a.m., picked up at 3:46 p.m. So while I was working, while I was trusting her to be a mother, she was playing house in a motel room. Something hardened inside me then. Not rage, something colder, more focused. I thanked Ron and left. Driving home, I realized I wasn't shaking. I felt clear. That night, my wife chatted about nothing. Grocery lists, bills, a show she wanted to watch. I nodded in the right places. Inside, I was already done. The next morning, I called a divorce lawyer. I didn't tell anyone else, not friends, not family, because I grew up watching infidelity destroy everything in its path. My parents cheated on each other, both of them, and the fallout didn't just hurt them, it detonated my childhood. Holidays ruined, trust shattered, years of bitterness that never fully healed. I refused to let that happen to my kids. This wasn't going to be loud. It wasn't going to be dramatic. It was going to be precise. The lawyer reviewed the evidence and nodded. "This is more than enough," she said, "but I want you to understand something. Her infidelity won't really affect the divorce settlement much. Custody, assets, it won't be as satisfying as you think." I smiled faintly. I'm not doing this for satisfaction. At least, not in the way she meant. I asked Ron for more information. About him. The man who thought sneaking around with a married woman made him untouchable. Ron delivered. His name was Bob. Married, 3 kids. And the part that made my pulse finally spike, he worked as a vice president of sales for his wife's father-in-law, a family business. Ron laid it out calmly, like it was just another case. "House is owned by his wife's parents," he added. "Title is in their name." I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. "Huh," I said. Ron raised an eyebrow. "You thinkin' what I think you're thinking." I nodded, but I didn't say it out loud, because at that point I wasn't plotting revenge. I was letting gravity do its thing. I asked Ron for more information. Copies, multiple copies, and one more favor. He looked at me for a long moment before agreeing. The day I had my wife served with divorce papers at her job, I didn't confront her. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I let the paperwork do the talking. When she called me later, her voice shaking, asking how I could do this, I told her calmly that we'd talk through lawyers. Then I hung up. At the exact same time, Ron was sitting across from another woman, Bob's wife, and he was about to show her the truth. I didn't need to be there. I didn't need to watch,
Because once the truth leaves your hands, it takes on its own life. And I knew, deep down, this was where the real damage would begin. I never spoke to Bob. I never warned him. I never threatened him. But by the time his wife finished reading Ron's report, Bob's life was already over.
I never found out exactly what Ron said to Bob's wife when they first sat down together. He told me later that she didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't throw anything. She just got very still, the way people do when something inside them locks into place and there's no going back. Ron said she asked him to go through everything twice: dates, times, photos, locations. She asked about the motel. She asked about my kids. And when Ron explained that my wife had been dropping her own children off like baggage so she could disappear for a few hours, that's when Bob's wife finally spoke. "That means," she said quietly, "that he did this while I was home with our kids." Ron told me she thanked him, not emotionally, just firmly, like someone who had just made a decision. From that moment on, I stopped thinking of what I was doing as revenge. Revenge implies action. It implies aggression. It implies intent to harm. What I was doing was something else entirely. I was stepping out of the way and letting consequences move forward at full speed. Still, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, after the kids were asleep, I'd sit alone and wonder if I'd gone too far. Not with my wife, I was past that, but with Bob. I didn't know his kids, they were innocent. Collateral damage was never part of the plan. But then I remembered the photos, the jokes, the cruelty, the way my wife mocked his wife's body, her motherhood, her sacrifice. They weren't thinking about kids when they met in that motel, so I stopped carrying guilt that wasn't mine. The fallout started quietly. Bob's wife didn't call him right away. She didn't confront him in tears. She cleaned out their joint account first, every dollar. Then she packed the kids and left. By the time Bob realized something was wrong, the house was empty. No note, no explanation, just absence. According to public court records, which I checked later out of morbid curiosity, Bob panicked. He called her parents. That was his first mistake. Because her father already knew. Ron had made sure of that, too. I imagine the conversation went something like this: Bob trying to explain, trying to minimize, trying to control the narrative, and her father, who had given him a job, a house, a family, listening silently, then asking one question: is it true? And when Bob didn't answer fast enough, that was it. He was fired, effective immediately. No severance, no second chances, just a door closing. The house followed. Since the title was in her parents' name, eviction wasn't complicated. Bob went from vice president to unemployed and homeless in a matter of days. And the divorce? It was brutal, publicly brutal. Court filings painted him as unstable, irresponsible, unfaithful. Restraining orders were issued. There were arguments that spilled into driveways and front lawns. At one point, Bob showed up uninvited and started screaming. His brother stepped in. Bob left with a broken nose. There were police reports, charges, jail time. Every step of the way, Bob did what people like him always do when consequences arrive. He escalated, and every escalation made things worse. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I didn't even talk about it much. But I did feel something unfamiliar: relief. Not because Bob suffered, but because justice had been proportional. Nobody planted evidence. Nobody lied. Nobody manipulated the system. The truth simply moved through the cracks and collapsed everything built on it. As for my own life, the divorce with my wife was quiet, civil even. We agreed on custody, focused on the kids, kept conversations minimal. She tried to apologize once. I stopped her. "There's nothing left to say," I told her. "Just be a good mom." And she was. To her credit, she showed up for the kids, stayed consistent, didn't poison them against me. We coexisted. That was enough. Years passed. The kids grew up, graduated, became adults with opinions of their own. They never asked for details. I never offered them. Bob disappeared. I checked once out of curiosity. Nothing. No LinkedIn, no Facebook, no record of him staying anywhere. Last I heard, he'd left the state. His ex-wife, on the other hand, did just fine. She took over her dad's business when he retired, ran it well, built something stable. Everything Bob had risked, she reclaimed and expanded. And me? I moved on. I didn't remarry. I didn't chase closure. I built a peaceful life centered around my kids and my own sanity. I don't hate my ex-wife. Hate requires energy, attention. She doesn't get either anymore. She exists only in the context that she's my kid's mother. Nothing more, nothing less. Sometimes people ask if I regret how things went down, if I wish I'd confronted him, if I wish I'd screamed or punched or made a scene. I don't, because the most devastating revenge isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't even need your presence. It just tells the truth and waits. I never spoke Bob's name out loud. I never had to, because long after the motel closed its doors, the damage was still echoing.
There's a strange myth people believe about revenge. They imagine it as a moment, a confrontation, a dramatic reveal. But the most effective revenge I've ever witnessed didn't feel like a moment at all. It felt like watching gravity work. Slow, unstoppable, indifferent. By the time Bob realized what had happened, there was nothing left to fight. No job to defend, no house to return to, no family waiting. And that's the part that still sticks with me. Not that he lost everything, but that he lost it without ever seeing my face. Because here's the truth most people don't want to admit. I didn't destroy Bob's life. Bob did that himself. All I did was remove the blindfold. The legal mess dragged on for months. Court dates, police reports, restraining orders layered on restraining orders. Every time Bob tried to assert control, it backfired. He argued in front of judges, showed up where he wasn't allowed, refused to accept boundaries, and every time the paper trail got longer. The system isn't kind to people who can't regulate themselves once they're exposed. Eventually, the noise faded. The court records stopped updating. The police reports ended. Bob vanished. People like him often do. They don't rebuild. They relocate. They change numbers. They convince themselves they were set up or unlucky. But deep down, they know. As for me, the quiet afterward was the real reward. No shouting, no lingering bitterness, no watching my kids get pulled apart emotionally. Just peace. Years later, my daughter once asked me something unexpected. "Dad," she said, "why didn't you ever talk bad about Mom after the divorce?" I thought about it for a long moment. "Because," I said, "the truth doesn't need help." And that's the lesson I carry with me. You don't always need to strike back. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is document, step aside, and let people face exactly what they earned. I never raised my voice. I never threatened anyone. I never even told Bob he was caught. Yet everything he touched collapsed, not because I burned his life down, but because it was already built on matches. Revenge doesn't have to be cruel to be complete. It just has to be honest. When someone betrays you and thinks they've gotten away with it, sometimes the cleanest justice is letting them live with the truth. If this story made you feel that quiet satisfaction, the kind that settles in your chest instead of exploding, hit like and subscribe. Share this with someone who believes revenge has to be loud. And tell me in the comments, what's the most powerful consequence you've ever seen come from simply telling the truth? Because sometimes, silence does the most damage of all.